Everyone wants the elevator to the penthouse, but nobody wants to take the stairs. We live in a world obsessed with shortcuts, life hacks, and overnight millions. But what if I told you that the only magic pill for success tastes like dirt, sweat, and tears? This is the story of a man who went looking for a miracle, only to find the truth buried under his own fingernails. Caleb stared at the eviction notice taped to his door, the bright orange paper fluttering slightly in the drafty hallway of his apartment complex. It was the third one this year. He ripped it down, crumbled it into a tight ball, and shoved it into his pocket, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He was 28 years old, and by all accounts, he was failing. He'd tried dropshipping, crypto trading, social media marketing, every get-rich-quick scheme the internet gurus promised would be his ticket to freedom, but here he was, broke, tired, and terrified of the future. He walked into his cramped studio apartment, the air stale with the smell of old coffee and desperation. His laptop sat open on a folding table, the screen glowing with yet another video of a 20-year-old billionaire explaining how easy it was to make 6 figures a month. Caleb slammed the laptop shut. He didn't need another strategy. He needed a miracle. That night, while scrolling through an obscure forum on business philosophy, he found a thread discussing a man named Elias Vance. Elias wasn't a tech mogul or a celebrity. He was an old-school industrialist, a man who had built an empire of manufacturing and logistics from absolutely nothing in the 70s, sold it all for billions, and then vanished into the mountains of Colorado. Rumor had it, Elias possessed a golden notebook, a journal where he had written down the singular secret formula to his success. People said he only took one apprentice every decade. Caleb felt a spark he hadn't felt in years. This was it. The shortcut he had been missing. He spent the last of his savings on a bus ticket and a cheap rental car. 2 days later he was driving up a winding gravel road that seemed to lead straight into the clouds. The air was thin and crisp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. At the end of the road stood a cabin that looked more like a fortress of timber and stone. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Caleb stepped out, shivering in his light jacket, and knocked on the heavy oak door. It creaked open, revealing a man who looked like he was carved from the mountain itself. Elias Vance had a beard like steel wool and eyes that pierced right through Caleb's rehearsed pitch. "I'm not buying anything," Elias grunted, starting to close the door. "Wait." Caleb jammed his foot in the gap. "I'm not selling. I'm here to learn. I want to be your apprentice. I want to know the secret." Elias paused, looking at Caleb's cheap sneakers and desperate expression. He let out a dry chuckle that sounded like rocks tumbling down a hill. "You want the secret, huh? You think you can handle it?" "I'll do anything," Caleb said, his voice trembling. "I've tried everything else. I just need to know how you did it." Elias opened the door wider. "Fine, you can stay in the shed out back. You start tomorrow at 4 a.m. If you complain once, you leave. If you ask about the notebook before I give it to you, you leave. Deal?" "Deal," Caleb said, his heart racing. He had expected an interview, maybe a test of his intellect. He didn't expect it to be this easy. He was wrong. It wasn't easy. At 4 a.m. sharp, Elias banged on the shed door. It was pitch black outside and freezing. Caleb stumbled out, expecting to go into a study or a library. Instead, Elias handed him a shovel. "See that pile of rocks?" Elias pointed to a massive mound of granite boulders near the tree line. "Move them to the other side of the yard. Stack them into a wall, 4 feet high, perfectly level." "Why?" Caleb asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What does this have to do with business?" "Rule number 1, Elias snapped. "No complaints. Get to work." For the next week, that was Caleb's life. He moved rocks until his hands were blistered and bloody. His back screamed in agony every time he bent down. He barely slept, collapsing onto his cot in the shed as soon as the sun went down, only to be woken up in the freezing dark to do it all over again. Elias didn't help. He sat on the porch, sipping coffee, occasionally yelling if a rock wasn't placed perfectly. By the second week, the physical torture shifted. The wall was finished. Caleb stood back, proud of the work despite the pain. Elias walked up, kicked the wall hard, and watched a few loose stones wobble. "Garbage," the old man spat. "Tear it down. Move the rocks back to the original spot." Caleb felt a surge of rage so hot it almost blinded him. Are you kidding me? I spent a week building that. And you did a poor job, Elias said calmly. Success doesn't care about your effort if the foundation is weak. Move them back. Caleb wanted to scream. He wanted to throw the shovel at the old man and drive away. But the thought of returning to his eviction notices kept him grounded. He gritted his teeth, swallowed his pride, and tore the wall down. Weeks turned into a month. The tasks became more bizarre. Caleb had to sand the entire deck of the cabin by hand, using only a small block of sandpaper. He had to chop wood until he had a cord perfectly stacked, then reorganize it by log size. He had to polish Elias's collection of antique tools until he could see his own reflection in the metal, often scrubbing the same wrench for 3 hours until Elias was satisfied. There were no lessons on compound interest, no lectures on market trends, no secret notebook. Just labor, mind-numbing, bone-breaking, repetitive labor. One rainy afternoon, Caleb was scrubbing the moss off the north side of the cabin with a stiff brush. The water was freezing, soaking through his clothes. His knuckles were raw, and he was hungry. He looked through the window and saw Elias sitting by the fire, reading a book, warm and comfortable. Something inside Caleb snapped. He threw the brush against the wall with a crack. He stormed around the house and burst through the back door, dripping wet and shaking with fury. I'm done, Caleb yelled, his voice echoing off the timber beams. I'm done with this games. You're just using me as free labor. You're a sad old man who gets off on torturing people because you're lonely. There is no secret, is there? There is no notebook. Elias didn't look up from his book. He turned a page slowly, the sound loud in the tense room. You finished? Yeah, I'm finished, Caleb spat, grabbing his bag from the corner where he'd left it that morning. I came here to learn how to be great, how to build something that matters, and all I've done is move rocks and scrub floors. You're a fraud. Elias finally closed the book. He stood up, and for the first time, Caleb noticed that the old man didn't look frail. He moved with a dangerous sort of grace. Elias walked over to a heavy oak cabinet in the corner of the room. He pulled a small brass key from his pocket, unlocked it, and withdrew a leather-bound journal, the golden notebook. Caleb froze, his hand on the doorknob. You think you've been wasting time, Elias said, his voice low and gravelly. You think you deserve this book because you suffered for a month. You think the world owes you a payout because you got a few blisters. Elias walked over and tossed the notebook onto the wooden table between them. It landed with a heavy thud. Go ahead, Elias said. Read it. Take it. It's yours. But I promise you, you won't like what's inside. Caleb stared at the book. This was it, the answer to all his problems, the key to the penthouse. He slowly walked back to the table, his heart pounding in his ears. He reached out with a trembling hand and opened the cover. Caleb's fingers brushed against the yellowed paper. He held his breath, expecting to see complex diagrams, stock market algorithms, or philosophical essays on leverage and capital. He flipped the first page. It was blank. He frowned and flipped to the next page. Blank. He flipped through the entire book, fanatically turning pages faster and faster. Every single page in the leather-bound journal was empty. There was nothing. No words, no secrets, no magic. Caleb looked up at Elias, his eyes wide with confusion and betrayal. It's empty. It's a joke. It's not a joke, Elias said, his face stern. It's the lesson. You made me work like a slave for a month for a blank book. Caleb's voice rose to a scream again. I want my time back. Sit down, Elias commanded. The authority in his voice was so absolute that Caleb's knees buckled and he fell into the chair. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table. Look at your hands, Caleb. Caleb looked down. His hands were unrecognizable compared to the soft, uncalloused palms he had arrived with. They were rough, scarred, and strong. The tremors of anxiety that used to plague him were gone. His hands were steady as stone. When you got here, Elias began, sitting opposite him, you were looking for a trick. You wanted the result without the process. You built that stone wall the first time, and it was garbage because you were rushing to finish it. You were thinking about the reward, not the rock. When I made you tear it down, you learned that doing it twice is harder than doing it right the first time. Caleb stayed silent, listening. When you sanded the deck, Elias continued, you learned patience. You learned that you can T-sand export until you finish the first one. When you polished the tools, you learned attention to detail, that the things people dan TC matter just as much as the things they do. Elias pointed a calloused finger at the blank book. That book is empty because there is no secret formula. The secret is that you have to write your own pages, and the only ink that stays on the paper is hard work. Not the kind of work you post about on social media. I'm talking about the boring, ugly, painful work that nobody sees. The work you do when you want to quit. Caleb looked at the book, then at his hands. He thought about the cold mornings. He thought about the wall. He realized that for the last month, he hadn't thought about getting rich once. He had been too focused on the task in front of him. He had learned how to focus. He had learned how to endure discomfort. You have the capacity now, Elias said softly. Before you came here, you would have quit your next business venture the moment it got hard. You would have looked for a pivot, a hack, a way out. Now you know you can move mountains, literally, one rock at a time. That is the power I gave you. That is the inheritance. Caleb stayed at the cabin for 3 more days, not as a servant, but as a guest. When he drove back down the mountain, he didn't feel the panic of poverty anymore. He felt a quiet, simmering confidence. He returned to the city and didn't look for a miracle. He got a job at a logistics warehouse, grunt work, the kind he used to think was beneath him, but he worked differently than everyone else. He showed up early. He organized systems that weren't his responsibility. He treated every box like it was the stone wall. It had to be perfect. 6 months later, the owner of the logistics company noticed he saw a young man who worked with a ferocity and precision that was terrifying. He promoted Caleb to floor manager. 2 years later, Caleb pitched an efficiency software idea to the owner, based on the problems he had solved on the floor. The owner backed him. It wasn't an overnight success. It was 5 years of 18-hour days. There were moments when the software crashed, when investors pulled out, when Caleb was so tired he hallucinated. In those moments, he would close his eyes and remember the freezing rain on the mountain. He would remember the moss on the cabin wall. If I can move that wall, he would tell himself, I can fix this code. If I can sand that deck, I can make this sales call. 7 years after he left the mountain, Caleb sat in a glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline. He wasn't a billionaire, but he was wealthy, and more importantly, he was respected. He had built a company that employed 300 people. His assistant knocked on the door. Sir, there's a young kid in the lobby, says he drove all night. Says he wants to know how you did it. He wants to be your apprentice. Caleb smiled. He swiveled his chair around and looked at the bookshelf behind him. On the top shelf, in a place of honor, sat a blank, leather-bound notebook. He stood up and buttoned his jacket. Send him in, Caleb said. And tell the maintenance crew to leave the pile of bricks out back. We might need to build a wall. Caleb walked to the window and looked out at the sprawling city. He realized now that Elias had been right about everything. The world was full of people running around with empty pens, trying to sign their names on the dotted line of success. They didn't understand that the paper would untake the ink unless you pressed down hard enough to leave a mark. He turned to face the door as the young, desperate kid walked in, eyes wide, looking for a savior. Caleb saw his younger self in the boy's face. You want to know the secret? Caleb asked, his voice steady and strong. The boy nodded eagerly. Yes, please, I'll do anything. Caleb picked up a heavy paperweight from his desk and held it out. Good, he said, because the elevator is broken. We're going to have to take the stairs.